The topic for today is loyalty. To whom, to what do people owe loyalty? And I'm going to talk particularly in the context of politics. That is, to what government, to what country do you owe loyalty? Now, these days, pretty much everybody is a citizen of some country. Most of the students in this class probably are citizens of the United States. Some of you are citizens of other countries. There are some people, a comparatively small number, who are citizens of two countries. But that's an interesting concept. In fact, it's fairly novel. Until pretty recently, the United States didn't recognize dual citizenship, and I think perhaps it doesn't even officially recognize dual citizenship. Governments want to know that you are loyalty to them and not to somebody else. And if you're a citizen of two countries, well, to put the extreme case, what do if your two countries go to war with each other? Who are you loyal to then? And some individuals might think, well, I don't have to be loyal to any particular country. Maybe my loyalty is more to my family, or my religion, or my friends, or a political movement that I'm part of. And maybe I don't want to be loyal to a government. Well, I'll tell you that most governments don't allow you that option. If you live within the boundaries of a particular country, or as political science would call it, a state, if you're within a state, that state claims control over your actions to the standpoint, to the extent that you have to obey their laws. If you disobey their laws, they'll throw you in jail. And so this idea of individuals belonging to countries, and maybe they're happy about it, maybe they're not happy about it. This is a question that is comparatively new in human history. Before about 500 years ago, there really weren't recognized countries in the way they're recognized today. And so there were empires, and there were fiefdoms, and there were kinds of organization. But governments weren't usually powerful enough that they could enforce their laws throughout their boundaries. People might ascribe higher loyalty to something like a church. So somebody would say, I'm a Muslim first, and then I am a citizen of Iraq second. Or in earlier times, in Christendom, as it was called. So Christendom was the realm of Christianity. And individuals were Christians before they were Frenchmen or Englishmen or Irish or whatever they might be. Anyway, but we're going to talk about political loyalty, and particularly I want to talk about this question in the context of the United States, in the context of American history, specifically today, in the context of the American Revolution. Because the American Revolution put people in the unusual position of having to make a decision. Are you loyal to this country or to that country? Now, for most people, this doesn't come up unless the people actually physically get up and move from one country to another. So, if you were born, let's say, in Texas, but you decide to move to Canada, or you decide to move to Japan, maybe you take a job there, or you go to school there, or you fall in love with somebody who's from Japan or from Canada. And you decide to move there, and you like it, and you say, okay, this is going to be my permanent residence. And then, and most countries have a category of permanent residence. So you live here, you're not a citizen yet, but you have certain rights and responsibilities. By the way, this question of citizenship is not all about rights. It's as much about responsibilities as it is rights. And this is going to come up as I get back to the specific topic of conversation today. So, but when people today, when most people, in fact in most of history, when they have to make a decision, am I going to be loyal to this government or not? If it's not the country of their birth, for which you don't opt in, you are opted in by birth in nearly every case. The only time you have to make a positive decision, it's this country rather than that country, is if you move to another country, if you emigrate from one country and immigrate to another country. And if you move to this new country, you can decide, okay, I want to become a citizen. And if their rules, if their laws allow, then you can become a naturalized citizen of that country. And at that point, you're a citizen. And usually, In fact, maybe in every case. You have to forswear, that is, you have to give up loyalty to the previous country that you were from. Because again, this question of loyalty, who are you loyal to? When push comes to shove, will you side with us or them? Now this question of categorizing people into us and them, the good folks, that's us, and the bad folks, those are the other people, it's one of the questions that has vexed humanity for all of human history. And much of the mischief, much of the trouble that happens comes from people categorizing, well, it's my group, and then there's that other group. And that other group is the bad people. They're the enemies. But it also comes from a natural instinct in that in the, we'll call it the pre-human world, or even in the world of humans, very often strangers were a threat. Strangers were an enemy. And so countries, nations formed out of this sense of we've got to band together. We've got to hold ourselves together against these potential enemies. And if we don't, we might all get killed. So this question of loyalty, it emerged over time, but it eventually assumed all of these political connotations. Anyway, so as I say, for most people to say it's this country or that country, it happens rarely, and it happens only to those people who move to another country and decide, okay, I want to be a citizen of this other country rather than a citizen of the country that I'm from. As I say, nowadays, for some people, you can be a citizen of both. And I don't know if this actually happens with naturalized citizens. Some of you may actually know, maybe having experienced this choice. It can also occur if you are a child of parents, and one parent is a citizen of one country and another parent is a citizen of another country. And then many countries acknowledge citizenship by parentage, by birth. So that could come up. But the question in the context of the American Revolution, which we're studying right now, came up in a very different way. And it came up in the form that it wasn't the people who changed countries, it was the countries who changed people. So I want you to imagine that you are a law-abiding, peace-loving citizen, well, I won't use the term citizen because in those days it wasn't common, subject of the British Empire. Subject to the British Empire, but basically it had the same connotation as citizen. So we'll call you a citizen of the British Empire. In 1776, okay, to pull a year out of the air, you're a citizen of the British Empire in 1776, and you have been a good and loyal British citizen, subject, for your whole life. And maybe you're 18 years old, maybe you're 40 years old, maybe you're 60 years old, maybe you're 70 years old. And on occasion, you have had differences with the British government. Governments are fallible like the people who make them up. And you thought, well, maybe those laws that they passed weren't such a good idea. Maybe you thought, for example, that the Stamp Act, so I want you to imagine we're in 1776, but you're old enough to remember the Stamp Act of 1765, and you thought that was a bad law because it imposed taxes where there hadn't been taxes before. It caused a great deal of upset in the colonies, and I'll call them colonies because they were colonies. They were ultimately called provinces, but they weren't states, at least not yet. And you thought it was a bad law. And in fact, maybe you joined the protests against the Stamp Act. And you got out there and you marched and you held a sign. Well, they didn't hold signs much when they protested in those days, but maybe even threw rocks at the stamp collectors. And you just yelled and you shouted outside the governor's office and all this stuff. So you made it clear that you didn't like what Parliament, the branch of the government that made laws for the British Empire, had done. And this was your right. It was considered a right to protest, and you did. And partly as a result of your protest, the British government changed its mind, and it repealed the Stamp Act. And you thought, okay, well, that was good. It responded to the felt grievances of the American people. Now wait a minute here. The American people, I used a term that really wasn't in common usage in those days, certainly not as much as it would become. The British Parliament had responded to the grievances of the people of Pennsylvania, or of Massachusetts, or of North Carolina, or of the provinces, or of the colonies. Americans, yeah, there were a few people who were talking about Americans, but that wasn't the most common way of thinking about who people were. This is actually going to become an important point. But anyway, so you are a British citizen, subject, and you have complained about certain laws of the British government, and sometimes they changed their laws, sometimes they didn't. In fact, the British Parliament turned around and passed other taxes, import taxes called duties, and you had to pay those. You didn't like them, but again, you don't get everything you want in life or in politics, and so you said, all right, I'll pay them. But you never seriously questioned your loyalty to the government because you were born a British subject. You had, maybe conceivably, you had served in the defense of the British Empire against the French in the French and Indian War, as it was called in America. And so, all right, so there you are. And then you wake up on a July day in 1776, and you read the newspaper, or maybe you hear it at the local coffee house or sort of meeting, and you learn that you have been declared a traitor. A traitor, you ask? A traitor to who or to what? You haven't done anything differently than you had done before. As far as you can tell, you haven't done anything wrong. And you learn that you have been declared a traitor by the new government, let's say you're in Philadelphia, a new government of Pennsylvania. This new government of Pennsylvania, it didn't exist 2 weeks ago, but now it does exist, or at least it didn't exist in its present form. There was an assembly, a provincial assembly in Pennsylvania, and there had been. Maybe, in fact, you had been a member of the assembly. But you learn now that this government has said it's an independent country. Now, what I'm really speaking of here is the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence was this common statement by the Continental Congress in which the various states were represented that these United States, for the first time they're calling themselves states, and states has this political science term which means a political system that is sovereign in this particular area. For the most part, in the United States, we use the term country or nation to apply to that because we have separate individual states. And you know why we have separate individual states? Because in 1776, those separate individual states were independent countries. Now you live in the country of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has declared itself a country, and it is no longer beholden to the British Empire. It no longer has to answer to the British Parliament and the British Crown. So say these new people who call themselves the government of Pennsylvania. And not only do they call themselves the government of Pennsylvania, they say that anybody who persists in loyalty to the British government and acts on that loyalty is a traitor to the state of Pennsylvania and is liable to be thrown in jail and have their property confiscated. And you're scratching your head at this and saying, what in the world is going on? In fact, has the world really changed that much? That, I've been doing all the stuff that a loyal, honest citizen is supposed to do. And all of a sudden now I'm declared a traitor. And as I say, I could be thrown in jail. I could have my property taken away. Conceivably, I could be executed. And nothing has changed in me. I haven't done anything. But the world has changed around me. Well, that was exactly the position that thousands and thousands and ultimately, maybe millions of Americans, or maybe I should say residents of Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania, South Carolina, North Carolina, all the 13 colonies, now states, or maybe not states, because if you're loyal to the British government, you think they're still colonies or provinces. But you don't think that they're independent states. And so you're faced with this situation. What do you do? Well, this was a question This was a question that became imperative for everybody in the colonies to answer. And it was a question that really tore the country, I won't say in half, but in pieces. Because by the best estimates, and these are only guesses, but the authority that is often cited is John Adams, the founding father who was attuned to the politics of the time, probably better than most people. And John Adams said that at the start of the American Revolutionary turmoil, he said probably a third of the people were patriots. Now, labels in politics are always kind of suspect because people label themselves with the most positive sounding term that they can come up with. So the Patriots called themselves patriots. Sometimes they called themselves Whigs. That associated them with a particular party in Britain. But patriot was the one that stuck. And patriotic is usually considered a positive adjective. So if you're patriotic, that means you're a good citizen, you're a good person. And so the Patriots, they were the ones who were in favor of independence, the ones who backed the idea that this colony of Pennsylvania, to take the case of Pennsylvania, is now an independent state. This colony that was before subordinate to the British government, and the people who lived there were required by law to obey the laws of Britain. They no longer have to obey the laws of Britain. They have to obey the laws of this new entity, this state, this independent state of Pennsylvania. And in fact, to emphasize the fact that Philadelphia is independent, they called their chief executive officer no longer a governor, they called that person president. And so Pennsylvania now had a president, because independent countries can have presidents. Governors are just what you have in provinces, or we have them, of course, in states. Anyway, so John Adams said that a third of the American people were these patriots. He said a third were loyalists. And loyalist is, well, I'll let you decide whether loyalist is a positive sounding term. Usually loyal, that's good. You want to be loyal to your friends, and under most circumstances, you want to be loyal to your country. So loyalists, all right, those are the ones, but they're loyal not to this new entity called Pennsylvania. They're loyal to Britain. In other words, they retain their loyalty to the country that they were formerly associated with. So Adams said that about a third of the population were patriots, the ones who were loyal to this newfangled entity, the independent state of Pennsylvania, and a third were loyalists. And Adams is actually referring to the country as a whole. So a third of the Americans were patriots, a third were loyalists, and a third were in the middle. And the third were in the middle, maybe because they couldn't decide, they didn't want to flip a coin, maybe they were just waiting to see which side would win. For the most part, they just wanted to be left alone, because it was really clear that becoming an outspoken patriot or an outspoken loyalist was certainly going to get you in trouble with one side or the other. If you're an outspoken patriot, the loyalists wouldn't like you, and vice versa. And so maybe if you're in the middle and you just can sort of keep your head down, then maybe things will blow over. But first of all, not everybody's inclined to do that. Some people are quite forthright with their opinions and their loyalties. And then there's also a question of, well, what do you want your future to be? Do you want to be part of this independent state? Or, I should say, an independent state that has no track record and no one knows what its future is going to be? How is Pennsylvania going to fare in the world? Will it actually be part of a larger country? Nobody was really thinking of the United States as a country, and one of the ways we know this is that when people spoke of the United States in those days, they didn't say the United States is a country, they say the United States are. They used the United States as plural. It was an alliance, in essence. A confederation, in fact, is the term that would later come into use, but it's sort of like NATO today. So the United States has allies with Britain and France and Germany and various other countries that are part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But no one would claim that the German government is sovereign over citizens of the United States. And so the same was true. no one thought that the government of Massachusetts had any hold over citizens of Pennsylvania or South Carolina. So they were independent countries independent of each other. But they also claimed to be independent of Britain. And so the question is, the first question is, how is Britain going to respond to this? And the answer was fairly certain, in that, the British government wasn't going to like it. And secondly, when part of a country, when part of an empire all of a sudden says, you know what, we want to be independent, usually the empire itself, the rest of the country, says, no, you can't. And if you want to be, at the very least, you're going to have to fight for it. So it was fully expected that Britain would respond by military force. In fact, Britain was already engaged in a contest of arms with the Americans, and I'll use the term American just for convenience, because fighting had broken out over a year earlier. And it was fighting for nobody knew exactly what. George Washington headed up the Continental Army. The fighting began at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts in April 1775. And it was really about, could the British troops disarm this group of Massachusetts militia? Because the British troops were sent out to seize the arms so that those militiamen wouldn't be able to cause trouble. And the militiamen resisted the so-called Minutemen, and firing was exchanged, and so fighting began. But nobody knew quite what the fighting was for until the Declaration of Independence, at which point the Continental Congress says on behalf of what it claims are the American people, that this is for independence. But again, we've got maybe a third of the population that says, we don't want independence. We want to stick with what we've got. We think the British Empire is this pretty good thing going. It's one of the most, it might be the most powerful empire in the world, and we've grown pretty rich and secure within the British Empire. And so what do we want to do? Embark on this risky project. Well, the American Revolutionary War consisted of fighting between Americans and the British. That's sort of the basic outline. But, in fact, the fighting in the Revolutionary War also included fighting between Americans and Americans, in particular, between American patriots and American loyalists, because as soon as the different states declare their independence, they all write laws basically outlawing loyalism. That is, outlawing the continued loyalty to the British government. And the laws were enforced with various degrees of rigor. So, in some of the states, simply being mildly loyal to the British government and not really doing anything about it might not get you into much trouble. However, sometimes it did because, as the fighting went on, as the war went on, the governments needed money. They needed resources to fight the war. And it was really tempting to look at a big house owned by a loyalist and say that person is a loyalist, and therefore that person is subject to the loss of his property. And we'll seize that property, and then we'll sell it and use the money to support the Patriot Army. And that was done. But then, of course, there were also loyalists who said, well, we've got just as much right to determine the future of Pennsylvania or Massachusetts or New Jersey, you pick your one, as those patriots. The patriots, they're calling us traitors. They're the traitors. They're the ones who became disloyal to the country of their birth. They were born British subjects. And now they're saying we're no longer British subjects, we're this new thing. And they're fighting a war against the British government. Treason usually consists of fighting a war against your own country, very often in league with another country. And before long, in fact, the American Revolutionary War would bring in France. And so the Americans were fighting sort of on the same side as France against Britain. And so from the standpoint of the loyalists, the traitors were not themselves, but the patriots. And if you could sort of step back beyond this and look at this from the standpoint of the moon or Mars, or from somebody who had no skin in the fight, and somebody maybe who doesn't live in the United States of America, because there's sort of a tendency to root for the side that gave rise to the country you live in. But if you could look at this from the outside, it would be probably fair to say that in 1776 or 1777, The ones who were really the traitors were the Patriots, because those are the ones who took the active step to say we're no longer loyal to the British government, and we're going to break out on our own. But of course, now, it took a lot of fighting, and I should point out that the fighting in the Revolutionary War was most bitter, not between the Americans and the British, but between Americans and Americans, because it is often the case that in civil wars, and in many ways, in fact, the American Revolution is best understood as America's first civil war, because the most bitter fighting was between Americans and Americans. And in order to win their war against the British, the Patriots first had to win their war against the American loyalists, and eventually they did. And this from a combination of, well, their arguments were persuasive. They had a political initiative that the loyalists to Britain didn't have. The loyalists were not particularly well treated by the British, and so their ranks eroded over time. Ultimately, the loyalists lost the argument and lost the war. They wound up on the losing side of the war. And when the war ended, one might have hoped to say, okay, let bygones be bygones, and okay, we'll just accept this new situation that Pennsylvania, to take the state that I've hypothesized that you live in, is now this independent part of an independent country, or an independent country of itself, and therefore, okay, I'll swear loyalty to Pennsylvania, and that will be that. But in fact, at the end of the war, tens of thousands of loyalists were essentially forced to flee, because they realized that without the British government, without the British Army to protect them, they didn't want to leave themselves vulnerable to retaliation by Patriots and the ones who had won. And so this is an aspect of American history that is often forgotten, the exodus of the Loyalists. And it's easy for Americans, as we celebrate, let's say, the 4th of July, American independence, to think that it was all Americans, were the good guys, and the British, they were the heavies in this particular case, and we get independence and everybody's happy about it. No, but in fact, there was one large group of Americans who were on the losing side, and they were made definitely not to feel welcome in this country that had been theirs, but had become a new country. And the Loyalists went off, they sailed off to Canada in some cases. They went to the West Indies, they went to England, and by and large, they weren't particularly well treated wherever they went. It was one of the downsides of picking the losing side in this particular war. But most of them still felt, okay, I was loyal. I suffered for my loyalty, but I stuck by my principles. And very few of them showed anything like sort of moral regret for having made a bad decision. No, they thought they'd done the right thing. They just wound up on the losing side of the war, and in some respects on the losing side of history.